As you may know, I love to paint watercolor flowers, and after some recent posts of my practice work on social media, I received a lot of requests to revisit this subject in a tutorial. So that's what we're going to do today, flowers and leaves in watercolor. Hi guys, my name's Shada Campbell, and on this channel I do watercolor tutorials, hand lettering, bullet journaling, and all kinds of crafty artsy stuff. So if you're new here, consider subscribing. Now let's get into the supplies for today's tutorial. I'm using a kansan watercolor paper block, cold pressed. The block means that all the paper is connected there, and that ostensibly means that it's stretched while you're painting, at least somewhat, and then you peel it off after you're all done. I'm also going to be using the koi watercolor set from Sakura, as well as some synthetic brushes. But I'm also going to assume that you know a little bit about watercolor supplies. I'm going to link a tutorial on supplies as well as a tutorial on the koi set in the description below. Now, because today's tutorial is somewhat of an intermediate subject, I'm going to assume that you understand techniques like wet in wet or wet on wet and wet on dry. But don't worry if you don't, I'm going to link my tutorial about that below. And as we get into our painting tutorial today, we're going to talk a lot about using the tip of your brush versus using the body of your brush when you're painting. Using your brush correctly will lead you to a much more sophisticated painting style, and working on flowers and leaves is a great way to practice this. So let's get started. Now I'm starting out today by mixing up a nice dark blue, I'm going to try to do a bit of a sophisticated color palette here with blues and sort of burgundy pinks. But when you're starting out and you're going to be focusing on technique, it doesn't hurt to maybe just say, I'm just going to paint in blue today, or black, or whatever color you want. So you don't necessarily have to pick a color palette. If you're thinking about your brushwork and technique, maybe just stick with blue. So what I'm going to do here is start off by painting some leaves. And you can see me using the very tip of my brush to make these delicate shapes. And I'm just doing that simple design that we do so often on the channel, where you start with a line and then you're drawing pairs, or you're painting pairs of leaves going down the length of that line. What I'm doing here is working with a wet in wet technique, and I've got, sort of a small puddle of water in each leaf, and I can add paint to that. I can add pigment, and you can see how the paint just sort of settles into the water, and I'm not worried about being in complete control of that paint. As the watercolor paint dries, especially when you have that pool wet or puddle wet, you call it, you get a very, very beautiful distribution of the paint. So you don't need to sort of worry about having control of it all the time. And you can see with the second leaf here, I'm adding a bit of pigment to the top and bottom of each leaf and just letting it pool out into the body of the leaf. I'm also working with the second leaf here. I've lightened the color. So even if you're working with one color, you can have such difference and variation, and that creates visual interest in your painting. So think about having some leaves are going to be very, very light in color. Others will be very dark. You can also employ a wet in wet technique for one leaf, and then for the next one you can do wet on dry and add a lot more detail to that leaf. So with just one color, you can achieve so much variation. Now, as I continue to paint leaves here, I want you to think about the piece as a whole. You saw it when the video first started. It's this big, crazy piece that's just covered in leaves and flowers. And I think creating a piece like that when you're just getting started can be so helpful, because you're not trying to worry about how the leaves and flowers relate to one another, or necessarily what looks natural. You're just going to layer on leaves and flowers and buds and get a little crazy with it. And that will help you to just sort of let go and work on the shapes of the leaves and flowers. Now that we've done some basic leaf shapes and tried out a little wet on wet, just seeing what the paint can do, I want to try doing something a little more intricate and detailed, and we're going to use the very tip of our brush. I'm using a synthetic round brush that has a very nice fine pointed tip, but also this sort of fat belly of the brush that holds lots of paint. And I'm using the tip of the brush to form these tiny little ovals, and then again using the very fine point of that brush to join them together to create this delicate sort of very tiny leaf design. When it comes to a leaf or a shape like this, it's not about being a master painter. It's just about taking the time to do something very tiny and detailed and having the confidence to say, it's okay, yes, it's small, but I have a brush that can do this. I can take the time to do this. Next, we're going to put a pause button on those leaves, both simple and intricate, and we're going to do a flower. I'm using pink for this, so it will, jump out for you guys watching, but if you're practicing right now, just keep going with that blue. For this flower, I'm using the tip and the body of my brush to kind of create these semicircles. So I'll start by doing this little semicircular line with the tip, and then I allow the body of the brush to rub up against the paper and create these more sort of out of control, wild, fat petal areas. So I start by doing a rounded line with the tip, and then I let the body of the brush fan out, and I just let the water and the paint do what it wants. When you're starting a flower like this, it's a little bit of an abstracted flower, I'll admit, but I sort of have the idea of maybe sort of an open English rose or a peony in mind. Maybe not a peony for this one, but I think some of the ones we'll do later in the video, you'll see the peony in it. For some simpler flowers, I just use the body of the brush to sort of fan out this triangular shape of color, and I use a wet on wet technique to add a little bit of a darker color and more pigment towards the bottom of that triangular shape, and you just sort of get these cute little flower-like shapes sort of peeking out. And we'll go back in and we'll use a wet on dry technique to add some more detail to those a little bit later. We'll let them dry. We're going to come down to another area of the page here and attempt another flower. Now this one, I think you'll see more of the peony in it. So I'm using the tip of the brush to do those semicircular areas. And then you'll see here, I just let the brush fall onto the page. So the body of the brush falls back from the point and allows more water and pigment and paint to hit the paper. And you just want to be really free around the edges of the flower. So you're using the tip to create this beautiful inner center with all these petals, these semicircles, and all this detail and pigment. But then as the flower moves outward and it becomes just petals, you're using the body of your brush to just sort of spread paint and color and water on the page. And really, I can't stress this enough. The beauty of watercolor is how the paint gets away from you. It's the lack of control that you have. And you just want to sort of see, what will the paint do? How will it run? How will it move? And sort of allowing yourself that freedom will create these beautiful flowers. I'm just adding some more leaf designs here as I wait for some of this paint to dry so that I can add a little more detail and I can start to add some of the stamens to the flowers. So I'm going back to leaves here for a few minutes, and you can see, if you can sort of see under my hand, I know I hold the brush in a really funny way and it makes it hard to see sometimes, but I'm doing that sort of more intricate design with the tri leaves. And I think you'll find when you begin practicing like this that you'll sort of fall in love with different leaf designs and patterns, and it's okay to repeat those. It's actually great if you can become proficient and comfortable with some different designs or different leaf shapes, and you'll find yourself going back to them again and again, and that helps create continuity within the piece and this repetition of design that can be very beautiful. And of course, it also helps you to build confidence, and you become more confident in doing that sort of shape or that kind of flower. And then you can play around and build your confidence. And you see here, we just did that design that's so reliant on using the tip of the brush. And now you can see here, I'm going to do this much messier sort of free leaf shape where I'm using the body of the brush to just spread paint and water. And it's not about having an exact idea in mind. I'm just sort of seeing, what can the brush do? What will the paint do? And then yes, I'm using the tip to create that very fine twig in between, and that's really what joins it and helps it look, so nice and a little more sophisticated. But I'm just laying the body of the brush right onto the page and allowing this sort of smudgy, crazy leaf design or leaf shape to emerge. I'll add a little more color to that wet paint, and I've got this sort of wild watercolor leaf that I'm really happy with. Now that the other paint has dried, we can go back in and add some detail. So here I'm drawing some lines and dots to represent the stamen or the middle part of those flowers, and that's just a simple wet on dry, and I'm really able to add a lot of detail at this point. Now I also want to show you guys how I do a sort of rosebud flower. This one's a lot of fun to paint. I always start with the idea of kind of a broken spiral. So you can see me using the tip of the brush and then a bit of the body of the brush to create these spiraling lines. And it's not a perfect spiral, it's an offset spiral. So you've got the center is going to be closer to one edge. So picture a spiraling circle, but the center of that spiral is closer to one side of the circle. And you can see how it creates this really pretty rose shape. And I'm just adding a little more pigment there around the center, around that initial spiraled area, and I just allow the paint to sort of soak outwards, and it gives this really pretty look of a rosebud. And don't worry, we're going to do another one right now so you can kind of get the hang of this. This one's going to be facing kind of the other direction, but again, I'm starting with the center of the spiral and the idea of the broken spiral that starts with these delicate lines, and then the lines kind of get thicker and more messy and watery and broken as we move outward from that initial spiraled area. So you can sort of pick which way these flowers are going to point. Are they growing upwards or downwards? And I've done two going different directions here, but you can see they still sort of look like a pear. And by leaving some negative space in your broken spiral, you give the look that the light is kind of hitting this flower, and it helps to create definition as well. While we're in flower painting mode, let's go up to the top corner where there's still a lot of negative space, and we're going to do another one of these sort of large, crazy peonies. So again, using the tip of the brush to create these semicircles, and then as you move outward from the center that you create, you're going to leave that negative space as your center. You're using the body of the brush, you're just sliding into that body of the brush to sort of allow these petals to get a little thicker and wider and a little crazier as well. So don't be afraid to lose a little control when you're creating a flower like this. And you're creating these little puddles of paint, and you can always add more pigment and just allow the paint to seep out and see what it does, see where it goes. So I know I reiterate this often, but you don't need to be in complete control of the paint, especially when you're starting out. As a beginner, I think it helps to have this attitude of, I'm just having fun, I'm taking joy in the materials, I just want to see what this paint can do. And I myself have a tendency to overwork my watercolor paints, and I'm always fighting that. And especially when I go back and look at it on camera, I can see the perfect point when that flower looked so nice and was going to dry in such an interesting way, and then I just went in and kept going and kept overworking it. So there's a point at which you want to pull back and say, you know what, I just want to see what this is going to look like when it dries, because the paint really does seep into the paper so nicely, and you can achieve some beautiful results. Now, another tip I want to give you when you're painting a piece like this, where you're just practicing your flowers and leaves, is to overlap. A lot of people think when they're starting out in watercolor that overlapping is sort of a no-no because you can never cover up one thing. But I think there's so much beauty in allowing your paintings, your leaves, and your flowers to sort of all overlap and blend into one another. And it gives a beautiful look when you're all finished. So don't worry if you're painting pink leaves over blue leaves. It's gonna look great, I promise you. Here what I'm doing is I'm just using the body of my brush to paint some yellow flowers, sort of doing nondescript shapes in sort of this peachy creamy, I shouldn't say yellow. So yeah, just allowing the paint to sort of move, and some of the flowers are triangular shaped and some are quite large with these sort of 4 petals, so that very simple idea of what a flower looks like. But you can do a lot by just creating triangular shapes and then going back in and adding the stamen later so that it really comes off as, yeah, this is a flower. Here you can see me overlapping another flower with a second flower. I've doing a rosebud right on top of that first flower that we did. But again, just adding layers of flowers and leaves and color, I think helps to create this almost abstracted floral pattern that could be wallpaper, or it could be wrapping paper. Or it could be the print for a dress. You're really creating a pattern at this point, but you're also just practicing your leaves and flowers and all these floral botanical shapes. But you're going to end up with something really cool. And I think that's what I love about this piece as a whole, and this practice as a whole. And here you're seeing me just go back in and practice my intricate flower or leaf design that's made up of those tri-ovals that are all connected by a very thin stem. I'm just waiting for the cream colored flowers to dry, and now they are. So now I can go back in with a contrasting color or a similar color, and I can add some lines and dots or whatever to represent the stamen or the center of the flower where all the nectar is and all that stuff. With that navy blue that I use for the stamen, I'm also adding some veining to some of these leaves, just having fun going in and adding some detail work now that a lot of this piece has dried. And by sort of offsetting some of these stamens, you can create the look that the flower is closed or sort of three-dimensional, as you can see on the left. Or if you're putting the stamen sort of right in the center, as I just did on the right there, you get this very open flower look. Here I'm using the navy again to just do another one of these rosebuds. I guess this is a blue rose. Just layering and adding more visual interest to this piece. So at this point, I'm almost just trying to fill in any negative space and just practicing all the different flowers and leaf shapes. As I said at the beginning of the tutorial, these flowers and leaves are such a great way to practice your brush technique. And you can see here how I pull the body of the brush across the page to make these sort of nondescript leaves. But you also see at the center of those flowers how we use the tip of the brush, that fine point, to create such detail. And I think as you practice this, you'll not only become proficient at watercolor botanicals, but at how to use a brush. Now here I want to show you one more sort of leaf design, and that is the eucalyptus. And I always start with just a simple fine line, and then you're doing these pairs of leaves going down the length of the line, but they're very nondescript. You really use the brush to create these funny little leaf shapes, and they can sort of be any which way. And then you just use the tip to create these little points at the top, and suddenly you've got this very sweet little seeded eucalyptus. And you can see me doing another one here. We just do the little pairs of nondescript leaves, just see what shape the body of the brush and all the paint and water and pigment that you have contained there, just see what shape it creates. And that's how you do the eucalyptus. Next, I'm continuing with some of these open sort of flowers and using the body of my brush to just lay down some paint, sort of in a fan shape or a triangular shape. And I'll use a little bit of a wet on wet technique to do the stamen for at least one of those. I'm going to let them dry for a moment and do some more detail work. Here I'm using a bit of that burgundy pink because the leaves don't have to be green, right? They can be pink, they can be blue. So definitely have fun with your color palette. Think about if you were wearing a dress. Maybe you don't like green, you don't want green leaves. And here I'm going to go back in. I've still got a bit of wet paint there, and I'm trying to create some depth and shadow. And I'm also going to, at least for one, use the wet and wet technique to give the look of the stamen in the middle of the flower. The other ones, I'm just sort of adding more paint to create the look of petals. and then they've already dried. So you can see me using the wet on dry to create a stamen on the one flower, and then here I'm using wet and wet to create yet another stamen. So both very different techniques, but they add equally great detail to these botanicals. Now here I'm just layering, so I've already got some leaves, but I want to go back in and add a darker leaf. So think about the depth of color as you come to a close with your piece. You'll add, a darker burgundy and darker blue or whatever colors you're working in, and that will really help the whole piece pop. A lot of watercolors fade to a lighter shade as they dry, so you'll go back in and you'll add more depth of color to complete your piece. And that's what it looks like when it's all done. You have layers of color and botanicals, layers of flowers and leaves. It's a great way to practice your botanical watercolor, but also to practice your brush technique. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial and that you found it helpful. If you're interested in picking up some of my watercolor clip art, you can find a pack that I've just released over on my Patreon. And since it's the beginning of March, you might also want to pick up your March printable planner layout. That's also available on my Patreon page. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next week with a new tutorial.